Why do some prayers feel like they vanish into the void, like you're screaming into the sky, and it just swallows your voice whole? Why does heaven stay silent when your soul is on its knees? And what if that silence wasn't abandonment at all, but an invitation to something deeper than words? My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm a wife, a mother of two, and I used to be a physical therapist. One of those people who helps others heal even when they themselves are still quietly broken. I didn't know I was carrying so much weight until the moment I came close to losing everything I had spent decades chasing perfection, spiritual answers, and some invisible validation I thought would finally make me feel enough. But everything changed the day I died on an operating table and lived to remember it. It started long before the surgery. In truth, it began the day the lake took my father. I was 7. We were on the water early in the morning, just my mom, my dad, and me. The sun was soft, the boat rocked gently, and I remember thinking it felt like the world was holding its breath. I didn't know it was about to break. One moment my father was laughing, the next, his hand was on his chest, his body lurching forward, a sound escaping his throat that didn't belong to any human I knew. My mother's scream cut through the stillness. And me, I prayed. I didn't even know how, but I did. Please, God, don't take him, over and over, please, please. But all that came back was wind-water silence. That was the moment my belief cracked, not because God didn't answer, but because I believed he never heard me at all. That silence followed me through the years. I tried to earn his attention. I became the good girl. I read every scripture I could find, thinking maybe one day, if I got it all right, he'd respond. Maybe he'd send a sign that my father's death meant something, that my grief wasn't wasted. But the heavens stayed quiet, and I kept performing, afraid that if I ever stopped, I'd disappear. Fast forward to my early 30s, I had a career I loved, a husband who held my hand even when I didn't ask him to, and 2 beautiful children who had no idea their mother still carried a wound from a lake decades ago. Then my back failed me again. It wasn't just pain, it was betrayal. I couldn't walk, couldn't work, couldn't lift my daughter. When she reached for me, I needed another surgery. Same hospital, same halls. I used to walk through confidently as a healer, now seeing them from a gurney, cold and exposed. The morning of the operation, I kissed my children goodbye, 9 and 6. They didn't know I was afraid I might not come back. My husband squeezed my hand in the pre-op room and whispered, "You'll be okay." I nodded. I didn't believe him, not because I feared dying, but because I feared not mattering. That my life, my love, my prayers had all dissolved into the same kind of silence I met on the lake. Anesthesia hit fast. I remember the ceiling lights swirling above me, fading. Then nothing, or so I thought. When I woke up, I wasn't in my body, I was floating. Not like a dream, but like consciousness had shed its skin and stepped into something truer. I was near the ceiling, looking down at the operating table, and I could see myself, my body lifeless, face down, tubes in place, surgeons shouting. There was no panic in me, just clarity. It was as if I had stepped outside fear. I could see the movements, the urgency, the blood, and yet I was untouched by all of it. And then came the knowing I was dead. Not metaphorically, not in a dream. Actually, medically gone. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt an overwhelming peace. Not the kind people describe casually, but the kind that goes beyond emotion. It was knowing I thought of my husband, my children, and all I could think was, I need to tell them I'm okay, that I'm still me, that I didn't vanish. With just that thought, I moved no steps, no effort. I drifted through walls into the hallway trying to find them. But something stopped me, a voice not heard but felt inside me. Pay attention to this man, I turned. A man in street clothes was rushing toward the OR, urgency in his stride. I could feel his thoughts. Yes, feel them like radio signals inside my being. I have to get in there now. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he went in anyway. And I knew with a certainty, I can't explain, that this moment was pivotal, that he would save my life. Then I was pulled again, not by will, but by force. I rose out of the hospital, out of the city, into the sky. Past the clouds, through a kind of darkness that wasn't terrifying but inviting. And there in the center of that cosmic void, I saw it. The tunnel, a living path made of energy and memory and something holy. And at the end, a light, not bright like a bulb, but radiant like love had taken on color. I entered and everything I had ever feared melted. I didn't remember being Evelyn. I didn't need to, because in that moment I was known completely. There was no pain, no lack, only a presence that wrapped itself around me and whispered in the language of being. You were never abandoned. I don't know how long I stayed in that place. Time didn't apply there, but I do know this. I had touched something eternal, something real, and it changed me from the inside out. That was the beginning of my near-death experience. Not just the story of how I died, but the story of how I began to live again. I followed him without question, though he never looked back. I didn't need an explanation. His presence was enough. Solid, ancient, calming in a way I didn't know I had longed for. As we climbed, the landscape around me began to shift like a dream, transforming while you're still inside it. The dryness beneath our feet gave way to green. The land softened, warmed, came alive. Lush grass spread outward, vibrant and impossibly rich. Then came flowers, wild, radiant, shimmering, as if each one carried its own inner sun. There was no path, and yet I knew exactly where to go. I wasn't walking anymore. I was moving as if thought alone could guide me. The air itself seemed to hum with intelligence, not just supporting my being, but celebrating it. Every breath, or what would have been breath in the physical world, was infused with clarity, like inhaling truth and exhaling everything I never was. We reached a river, its waters flowing like liquid crystal, glowing with colors I can't name. It wasn't just beautiful, it was conscious and alive. It reflected not only the light, but something deeper, something like memory and feeling intertwined. I could feel its awareness of me as I passed by, as if it recognized me from before I was born. My guide finally turned. His face was familiar in a way that bypassed memory. Not someone I knew from Earth, but someone I had always known. His eyes were ancient and kind, and though his lips didn't move, I heard him clearly inside me. You are safe, you are loved, but there is more to see. I looked across the river and my entire being froze in awe. Standing there on the other side, waiting, were the souls I never thought I'd see again. My father and my brother, my grandparents, one of whom I'd never met in this life, but recognized instantly with a knowing deeper than blood. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes lit with a joy that said everything words never could. They had been waiting, watching, not judging me, but loving me through every heartbreak I thought I carried alone. I wanted to run to them. I wanted to leap across that river, be held, be whole. But as I stepped forward, the guide raised his hand. Not yet. His message came like a breath. There is something else you must experience first. The river, the meadow, the shimmering presence of my family, all faded like mist, not erased, but folded away gently like pages in a sacred book. What rose before me next made my soul tremble, not with fear but awe. A structure stood there, tall and luminous. It pulsed with knowledge, as if every answer I had ever sought was alive inside it. White pillars stretched upward, glowing from within. This was no building. It was consciousness, a temple made not of stone, but of truth. We entered, though my body never moved. The inside was vast, silent, sacred. No walls in the traditional sense, no shelves, and yet it was full of light, a form of essence. Currents of information flowed in shapes I couldn't name but somehow understood. My guide led me toward the center, where a great table shimmered like water made solid. Around it stood beings, not male, not female, not human, and yet familiar. Their faces shifted between youth and age, their eyes holding something older than stars and softer than forgiveness. One of them turned to me and spoke not aloud but inside me. "We are going to look at your life." The table pulsed, and from it rose a vision. No, not a vision, a reliving. I was inside the moments again, but not just as myself. I felt the ripple of every word I had spoken, every glance, every silence. I saw my childhood grief not only through my eyes, but through my mother's, who had carried her own quiet torment. I saw my teenage years, the defiance, the doubt, and how even then I was being watched over by forces I didn't know how to name. The moments that pierced deepest were the smallest ones, the impatient sigh I gave to a patient who was afraid. In this life review, I felt their fear as if it were my own. And then, another moment, a night. I held my son after a nightmare, whispering, "You're safe." I felt his relief radiate like a light. How it anchored him, how that anchor rippled into his friendships, his tenderness with others. The effects of love echoed far beyond the act. This wasn't judgment, this was illumination, a revealing. No list of sins, no condemnation, only this. This is what you did, this is what it meant. This is how powerful your presence truly is. I wept, not from shame, but from the overwhelming beauty of it. The grace, the realization that nothing was wasted, not even my mistakes, especially not my love. The guide looked at me, and without words, I understood. Your life mattered, not because you were perfect, but because you stayed, because you loved, because you tried when you didn't have to. In that moment, something shifted in me forever. I saw how I had been trying so hard to reach God to earn love. But here I wasn't reaching, I was resting. I wasn't striving, I was seen. I wasn't seeking God anymore. I was standing in the very presence of the divine, not as a beggar, but as a beloved. That was the moment my near-death experience transformed from extraordinary to eternal. Because I wasn't outside life anymore. I was inside something truer, something timeless. I wasn't there to be tested. I was there to remember. And in the eyes of those beings, I found what no doctrine had ever shown me. Love wasn't something I had to deserve. It was what I had always been made of. The guide smiled with his whole being, and though he said nothing, I heard it clearly inside my soul. This is just the beginning. He led me out of that chamber of memories slowly, as if we were leaving something sacred behind, but taking its imprint with us. I was still trembling, not with fear, but with a reverence that touched every part of my being. I had just witnessed my life from the inside out. And what struck me most wasn't the big events, it was the little ones, the gentle gestures, the quiet regrets, the small kindnesses. I barely remembered that had changed someone else's day. It wasn't the grand moments that shaped my soul, it was the forgotten ones. And now I understood deeply and permanently that in the architecture of eternity, nothing is small. The corridor we stepped into shimmered like memory in motion. Light moved along the walls like living water. The air itself adjusted in color, as if responding to the shift in frequency, preparing me for what was next. Ahead stood another set of doors, arched, towering, beautiful beyond description. They didn't open with hinges, they opened with intention. And as they parted, I found myself staring into a space so vast and infinite, my breath, or whatever I had become, caught in awe. It wasn't a library in the earthly sense. It was a living consciousness of all that had ever been. Shelves floated, spiraling upward into infinity, filled not just with books or scrolls, but with shapes of thought, orbs of memory, glowing fragments of lives lived across galaxies and centuries. This was the archive of the soul, the place where every near-death experience and every full life converged into one radiant record of being. He didn't speak, but I understood. This is the library of lives. I stepped inside, each movement causing ripples in the luminous floor beneath me. It wasn't solid, but it held me like light carrying light. Silence reigned here, but it was not empty. It was full of stories of wisdom, of voices that didn't need sound to be heard. I could feel the presence of millions of souls, each with their own songs, regrets, triumphs, wounds, and love. I wasn't overwhelmed, I was home. A shelf lit up as soon as I noticed it. A single volume drifted toward me. Not heavy, not light, not paper, not digital. It looked like it had been bound with light itself, woven with threads of gold thought. The book didn't wait for me to open it. It opened to me. And what poured into me wasn't words, it was knowing. I saw myself again, but not just me. I saw my mother's hidden pain, my father's quiet strength, my brother's buried shame. I saw the spiritual DNA I had carried, absorbed, resisted, healed. I saw the way our lineages, our traumas, our love stories traveled not just through genes, but through soul agreements. My life was not isolated. It was a tapestry of hundreds, no thousands of stories, layered and alive inside me. Then another book floated forward. This one was darker, denser. I hesitated. My guide nodded gently. You need to see this too, and so I did. Inside it were the versions of me that never lived, the paths not taken, the almost choices. I saw a life where I never became a mother, one where I walked away from my marriage during the darkest year, one where I never survived childhood at all. These weren't judgments, they were possibilities. Roads that existed in the folds of potential. And with each, I felt a deep reverence, not for what wasn't, but for what was. Every choice I had made had shaped me. Even the mistakes, especially the mistakes. The message came not in words but in resonance. You are not judged by the road you choose. You are shaped by how you walk it. And even the detours become sacred when traveled with humility. Tears formed again not from sorrow, but from the recognition of just how much grace had followed me, even when I thought I was alone. My near-death experience was no longer just about dying and returning. It had become a revelation about the living, about how every breath we take on Earth is part of a much larger echo. We moved deeper still, halls stretched outward filled with other beings, not all in human form. Some shimmered like pure geometry, others like light sculpted into motion. I wasn't afraid of them. I felt like I belonged among them, like they knew me not from this life, but from before time wore names. One of them turned toward me and bowed slightly, not in worship, but in recognition. A soul greeting another soul. I bowed back, and something in me whispered, "I remember you." Then came the final chamber, small, intimate, familiar in a way that felt like Earth. At its center hovered a kind of musical staff, but alive like strands of sound waiting to sing. Notes floated above it, shimmering with light and emotion not written but lived. My guide looked at me and without a word said, "These are the prayers you asked others to send for you," and suddenly I felt them. My daughter's whisper the night before surgery. "Please don't let Mommy die." My husband's silent plea in the hallway. "Bring her back to us." A nurse's quiet murmur over a cup of coffee. "God help her get through this." Every prayer, every intention, every fragment of hope alive here. Real, resonant. These weren't just words tossed into the void. They were threads in the web of return. They hadn't saved me by force. They had sung to the part of me that was still deciding. They reminded me of my will, of my love, of my unfinished story. And in that realization, I felt the answer rise inside me like dawn. I will go back, not because I feared death, but because I had more love to give, because I now knew that even one ordinary life lived with presence could shift universes. My children's laughter, my husband's steady hands, the chance to hold someone's gaze and say, "You matter," that was heaven enough. The light around me pulsed gently like a farewell kiss on the forehead. My guide leaned in presence, brushing against mine like mist and memory. "You will not remember everything, but the knowing will remain. And when you doubt, look inside, the truth will whisper." And then, the library began to fade. The music softened. The luminous architecture dissolved like fog kissed by morning, and I began to fall back through the layers of light, back into time, back into this fragile, beautiful world where we think we are small, but are never truly forgotten. I didn't wake up. I returned, and I knew my near-death experience wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The light was now inside me, and I had work to do. The return wasn't abrupt. It didn't come with a jolt or a gasp. It was more like a tide slowly pulling back, like breath exhaled from the lungs of the universe. I didn't fall. I descended gently, as if heaven itself was reluctant to release me. The library, the guide, the music all faded like the end of a sacred song, and then I was floating again just above the sterile white glow of the hospital ceiling. Below me was a scene frozen in a moment of fragile desperation. My husband stood at the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide with that particular kind of terror that only comes when the one you love might be slipping away. My children, my precious children were standing behind him, my daughter trembling, my son's silent fists clenched. I could feel them as much as see them. Their pain wasn't something I observed. It lived in me. It reached up and wrapped around my soul with a force I didn't know love could carry. And then I saw him, the surgeon. The same man I had seen in the hallway during the peak of my near-death experience. He was no longer in street clothes. Now he was speaking softly, professionally, but his voice held the weight of reality. He looked exhausted, and though he tried to keep his expression neutral, I could sense the storm of thoughts behind his eyes. I hovered there, not as a ghost, not as a lost soul, but as a witness, as a mother, as a wife, as someone who had seen the other side and now stood balanced on the edge of both worlds. And then it happened. My daughter's voice, soft and quivering, rose into the air like a thread of light. "Please don't let Mommy die." It didn't echo, but it expanded. Her words became something more than sound. They became a frequency, a calling, a sacred tether that stretched upward, found me and wrapped itself around my essence. I didn't feel pulled. I felt held, as if her love had become gravity. And in that moment, I knew something that would change me forever. I had a choice. The light I had left behind still pulsed in the background of my being. I could feel it calling not with urgency, but with invitation. I could return. I could drift upward back into peace, back into presence. Or I could return here to the world of pain, of uncertainty, of messiness and imperfection. And yet also the world of their eyes, their hands, their prayers. That was when I felt it, my daughter's belief that maybe, just maybe, she could be enough to bring me back. And her belief wasn't rooted in logic, it was rooted in love. A kind of love that doesn't beg, it beckons, and so I chose. Not from fear of death, not from unfinished goals or bucket lists. I chose because I loved them too much to stay away. I chose because their grief mattered more than my comfort. I chose because love, real, grounded, sacrificial love is stronger than even the light of heaven. And then I was falling, not with weight but with surrender, not into fear but into form. I re-entered my body like water pouring into a familiar vessel. I felt the anesthesia still lingering like fog. I felt pain dull and distant. I felt weight, gravity, the slow hum of machines. But beneath all that, I felt something else, clarity. The kind that doesn't shout but rests quietly in the marrow of your bones. When my eyes fluttered open, the first face I saw was my husband's. His hand was gripping mine tightly as if letting go might end me. There were tears in his eyes, not loud sobs, just a quiet storm. My children were at my side. My son pressed his forehead to my arm. My daughter's small fingers clung to mine like a lifeline. I couldn't speak. My throat was too dry, my lips too numb, but I smiled, just enough. And that was enough. Hours passed, or maybe days. I was aware of time again, but it no longer ruled me. In a quiet moment, the surgeon came in. He checked the monitors, adjusted my chart, and said a few things I don't remember. But then our eyes met. I saw the same soul I had seen in that hallway. The urgency, the decision, the knowing that he had followed something unexplainable into that operating room. "I saw you," I whispered, barely audible. He looked confused. "Excuse me," I held his gaze. "I saw you outside the OR before you came in. You weren't supposed to be there yet, but you said to yourself, 'I have to get in there now.' You pushed past someone who thought you didn't belong. You saved me." His face went still, pale. His hands froze above the clipboard, and for a long moment he said nothing. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I didn't answer. I just smiled. Because how do you explain a miracle to someone who still believes the soul is confined to flesh? Later, when I was finally home, I walked through my house differently. I touched the walls like they were new. I stood in the sun and closed my eyes, letting the light hit my skin. Like a memory returned, I didn't tell many people about my near-death experience at first. Not because I feared disbelief, but because some truths are too holy for small talk. I carried it quietly, like a flame in my chest, like a song that only I could hear. But everything had changed. I noticed people more. I listened with my whole being. I stopped rushing. I let the sky pull me into moments. I let silence speak louder than sermons. I understood now that I'd returned not just to live, but to become, to carry that light back into a world that had forgotten it was sacred. My near-death experience hadn't ended. It had only just begun. And I had only just started to remember what life was meant to be. Strange about waking up in a life that used to feel like yours and realizing it no longer fits. I was home. My children were back in my arms. The world looked the same, but I was different. It wasn't just a matter of perspective. It was as if the veil had been lifted and suddenly I could see the scaffolding behind everything. Every gesture, every silence, every moment. And the first thing I saw clearer than ever was the lie I had lived under for so long. I was never enough. Before my near-death experience, I had always believed that salvation was something to be earned, that divine love had prerequisites, that I had to prove myself through obedience, through suffering, through self-denial. I carried that belief like a stone in my chest. Every prayer I whispered, every scripture I studied, every sleepless night I spent wondering if God heard me. It all came from that place of striving. When trying to pass a test she hadn't studied for, waiting for a grade that never came. But in that realm on the other side of death, none of that existed. There were no checklists, no punishments, no cosmic scoreboard, only presence, only knowing, only a love so absolute it made every fear I had seem absurd. There was no question of worthiness. The light didn't measure me, it knew me, and that knowing was enough. this body into this noisy, hungry, aching world, I didn't forget that, but I didn't always know how to carry it either. There were days I would find myself falling back into old thought patterns. I would hear people talk about who gets into heaven, who deserves God's mercy, and my chest would tighten. One afternoon, I overheard two women after a church service whispering, as if salvation was a secret that could slip through their fingers. "Done enough," one of them said. The other nodded. "We've got to keep working at it." Something inside me broke. I had to step outside. I leaned against the trunk of a tree, felt its bark under my palm, and whispered into the wind. They still don't know, because I had seen the other side. I had been there. And what greeted me wasn't judgment. It wasn't a divine checklist. It was love so complete it made me ache. Love that didn't ask why I had faltered. It didn't require perfection. Love that simply said, "You are here. That is enough, and still. I struggled with how to speak of it. It's hard to explain eternity to people who still measure time by hours and tasks, so I kept it close. I wrote about it in my journal, scrawling truth between grocery lists and reminders to pick up the kids. I wrote, not because I needed anyone to read it, but because the words were alive inside me and they needed somewhere to rest. Life review the way it had shown me the ripple of my smallest choices, not to shame me, to illuminate me. I hadn't been weighed by my sins. I had been shown the power of my presence. A kind word that echoed through someone's grief, a harsh glance that seeded doubt, the way my arms had comforted my son after a nightmare creating a legacy of safety. He would one day pass to someone else. None of it was held against me, it was held with me. Hand on my shoulder saying, "Look, my dear, this is how powerful you are." And suddenly I understood the real weight of that lie, that worthiness was conditional, that only the holy got to be held, that only the clean were loved. It was a lie that had twisted so many hearts, including mine. A lie that made me believe my father might be suffering somewhere because he hadn't prayed the right prayer before his final breath. But I had seen him in the light, whole, smiling, free. For rescue, he was already home. That realization shattered the chains. I didn't even know I was still dragging. I began to see people differently. The cashier with tired eyes who barely looked up. The mother screaming at her toddler in the parking lot. The man yelling into his phone at a red light. I no longer saw strangers. I saw souls, radiant, weary, burdened, sacred. And I couldn't unsee it. But awareness comes with responsibility. I knew I wasn't meant to preach, to convert or convince. I was here to remember out loud, to be a mirror, to let others catch glimpses of their own light when they saw mine. So I started writing more. Not doctrine, not sermons, just truth, the shimmering kind, the kind that flowed like the river I had once stood beside on the other side. I wrote about the sacred notes of prayer. I wrote about the shimmering trees that pulsed with consciousness. Child, I used to be the one who thought her prayers had gone unheard, and how I had finally forgiven her. One evening, my daughter came home in tears. A friend at school said, "God only loves people who go to the right church," she whispered. Her voice was small, wounded. I knelt in front of her, cupped her face in my hands, and said, "That's not true. God loved you before you even took your first breath, and will love you long after your last. You don't have to earn it." She didn't say anything, but her shoulders dropped, her breath softened, and that was enough. I had planted the seed because that's what the near-death experience had shown me. Love is not a reward, it's a law of being, like gravity, like breath. One act of compassion ripples through time. One moment of presence changes a lifetime. One life lived awake shifts the world. And my only job now was to remember. Not just for me, but for everyone who had forgotten who they really were. Broken, we are becoming. And love is not waiting for us to be perfect, it's waiting for us to see. Some nights I lay awake long after the rest of the house had gone still, not out of worry, not out of fear, but because something in me stayed awake with the stars. It wasn't insomnia, it was remembrance, a kind of sacred hum that seemed to echo just beneath the silence, a song from the other side that had followed me back into this world, woven into my breath like a second pulse. I couldn't always hear it with my ears, but I always felt it in my chest. And it whispered one thing over and over: you are still connected. After my near-death experience, I didn't feel like I had come back from somewhere. I felt like I had brought that somewhere with me. It lived in the way I looked at people now. It was in the way I walked into a grocery store, the way I touched a doorknob, the way I paused before responding to someone who spoke from pain. Nothing felt small anymore. Everything shimmered with consequence, not because it might be judged, but because it might be sacred. I tried to return to my old life, I really did. I attempted to dive back into the schedules, the to-do lists, the social obligations. I smiled where I was supposed to smile. I said I was fine when people asked. But deep down, I was no longer content with surface. I had seen too much, felt too much. I couldn't pretend anymore that the world was ordinary because it wasn't, not even close. Then one afternoon, someone invited me to speak to a group of hospice volunteers. Just share your story, they said. Nothing formal, just you. My first reaction was hesitation. How could I speak of what I had seen without sounding like I was unraveling? How do you explain that the afterlife is less about clouds and more about light that knows you? But then I remembered the beings of light in the library, the way they had shown me my life, not to shame me, but to awaken me. And I realized maybe I wasn't meant to explain the light. Maybe I was meant to reflect it. So I said yes. When the day came, I stood in a small circle of strangers' chairs pulled close like we were about to share secrets instead of sorrows. My palms were sweating. My voice trembled. But as soon as I spoke about the river, about the man in the robe, about the shimmering leaves that breathed with consciousness, something shifted. The room got quiet, not just in sound, but in energy. As if their souls leaned forward before their bodies did, I told them how my near-death experience had dismantled every belief I had about punishment and reward, how it had shattered the image of God as a distant judge, how in the light I was not tested, I was tended to, not measured. I was met. There were no requirements, no gatekeepers, just presence, pure patient, perpetual. One man in the back raised his hand. Then what's the point of all this, he asked. Why are we here? I didn't think I just answered. To love, I said. Not just the people who are easy to love, not just the ones who agree with us. Everyone, especially ourselves. My voice cracked on that last word, because that I've learned is the hardest part. Loving others is something we're taught from childhood, but loving ourselves, seeing ourselves as sacred even when we're flawed, even when we're afraid, even when we fall apart, that's a practice, a remembering, a homecoming. After that gathering, people started reaching out. Some wrote letters, some found me after yoga class or in line at the pharmacy. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? They'd whisper. And I would listen, not as a counselor, not as a healer, just as someone who had died and come back and remembered how much it matters to be heard. What I realized is that most people don't need answers. They need presence, not advice, just someone to sit beside their silence and not be afraid of it. And I could do that now, because I had seen where silence leads. Sometimes I thought about my guide, the one who walked ahead of me beside the glowing river, who never said his name, but whose presence said everything I remembered. How when I had begged to stay, he had gently turned and told me not yet. At the time, it felt like a denial. Now I understood it as mercy, because there were still hands to hold. Still. Stories to witness. Still people who needed a reminder that this life was never a test, it was a sacred unfolding. My children were growing fast. One evening as I tucked my son into bed, he looked up at me and asked, "Do you think our souls come from stars?" I paused. Maybe I said, "I think our souls are bigger than anything we can see, bigger than stars, bigger than bodies." He nodded like he already knew. And maybe he did. Children remember things we've forgotten. I no longer spoke about hell, not because I feared it, but because I had seen a deeper truth. People carry enough hell inside them. Shame, isolation, self-rejection. And I knew now that the greatest suffering isn't fire. It's forgetting you are loved. I had touched the place where no soul is forgotten, where grace isn't earned but remembered. And that's the message I wanted to live. Not preach, not argue, just live. Some days I still got impatient, still snapped at the kids when I was tired. Still judged myself too harshly, but I noticed it faster. I forgave myself quicker because I could still see those eyes from the other side, the ones that looked at me with such profound compassion. I thought I might dissolve. I knew what they'd say now every time I fell short. "It's okay, keep going, you're learning." That's what I wanted to offer others. Not perfection, not platitudes, just that gaze, that reminder that we are not here to perform. We are here to remember. And on quiet mornings, as I sipped tea in the corner of my kitchen while the sun crept across the floor, I would sometimes close my eyes, press my hand to my chest, and whisper, "I'm still listening, I haven't forgotten." Because this life, this beautiful, broken, holy life, was never a test. It was always an invitation to come home, to ourselves, to each other, to the love we already are. After everything I had seen on the other side, the light, the river, the beings of wisdom who didn't need to speak to be understood, I thought the real miracle was there, but I was wrong. The real miracle began after I came back in the places I least expected it. It wasn't in visions or signs or revelations. It was in the grocery aisle under fluorescent lights, in the sound of my daughter's bare feet slapping the hallway floor, in the weight of a coffee mug in my hand on a cold morning. Heaven hadn't stayed behind. It had followed me home, hiding in plain sight inside the sacred ordinary. I started talking to the sky like it was an old friend, because that's what it felt like. Not a distant God I had to convince, but a presence I could confide in. Sometimes I whispered as I watered the garden. Sometimes I said nothing and just looked up with my whole heart open. I didn't expect answers. I wasn't waiting for miracles. I was just showing up available, present, the way the light had been for me, the way the voice had whispered, "Follow me," and changed everything without needing a reason. Before my near-death experience, I lived as if life had to impress me before I would slow down and pay attention. I waited for big moments to feel grateful, waited for something spectacular to call holy. Now I know better. The holiness is constant. It lives in burnt toast and tired eyes and traffic lights that turn red at the worst possible moment. The sacred doesn't knock. It waits patiently for us to remember. One morning as I crossed the street holding my son's hand, I felt the warmth of his little fingers wrapped tighter around mine. And just like that, I nearly cried, because I knew that in a few short years, he wouldn't reach for me that way anymore. And this moment, this mundane blink and miss it instant, was something eternal dressed in ordinary skin. That's what the near-death experience had given me. Not just a glimpse of what comes after life, but a new way of seeing life itself. Not as a blur of tasks and years, but as a mosaic of moments, each one an invitation to be present. Of course, the world didn't change just because I had bills still needed to be paid. Grief still lingered in the headlines. The weight of other people's pain still found its way to my doorstep. There were days I couldn't hold it all. Days I looked around and asked, why did I come back? Why me? The love I had felt in the beyond was so vast, so forgiving, so complete. It felt too big for this world, too luminous for a planet still learning how to love itself. And in those moments of ache, I remembered the tunnel, the voice, the invitation. I remembered that I didn't come back to fix the world. I came back to love inside it, not to be a spotlight, just a lamp, a small, steady flame. Even with that understanding, there were days the ache would return. It would rise unexpectedly while folding laundry or driving past the lake where my father had died, or hearing a child cry in a grocery store. I learned not to resist it. The pain, too, was part of the miracle. It reminded me I was still here, still learning, still soft enough to feel. The near-death experience hadn't made me invincible. It had made me more human, more open, more willing to be touched by life even when it hurt. I started noticing that people came to me differently now. Strangers told me things they hadn't told their closest friends. They didn't know why. Neither did I really, but I think it was because they could feel it. The softness, the quiet, the space where I would hold their truth without trying to fix it. I had learned in the light that presence is more powerful than words, that sometimes what saves us is not advice but being seen, and so I made it a practice to really see people. The cashier with the trembling hands, the exhausted mother on the park bench, the man behind me in line who couldn't stop checking his watch, not to judge them, just to witness them. Because the act of witnessing, I now believe, is sacred. I remembered how I used to cry out to God as a child, asking why He had taken my father, begging for answers. But after my near-death experience, I realized the answers weren't the point. The presence was, God didn't respond with explanations. God responded with nearness, with stillness, with a kind of knowing that asked for nothing in return. And so now when people asked me questions I didn't know how to answer, I didn't panic. I just sat with them in the silence. Because sometimes silence holds more truth than 1,000 words ever could. I kept a small blue-gray stone on my nightstand. Nothing special about it, really, except that it came from the riverbank near the hospital on the day I was discharged. I had bent down and picked it up without thinking. It fit perfectly in my palm, as if it had been waiting. I held it often, especially when I felt myself drifting back into the fog of forgetfulness. And I would whisper to it not because the stone could hear, but because I needed to speak the remembering aloud. Show me what I've stopped noticing, I'd say, and always something in the world would shift: a bird's shadow on the sidewalk, the scent of rosemary in the air, the way my daughter kissed my forehead without saying a word. They weren't grand gestures, they were gentle awakenings. The most powerful thing the near-death experience taught me is that God doesn't live in the unreachable. God lives in the repetition, in the choosing, in the way we come back to love again and again, even after we forget. Especially after we forget. Every time I chose to forgive instead of resent, to stay soft instead of snap, to listen instead of react. I was building an altar, not with stone, with presence, and so I moved through my days not with urgency, but with reverence. Every heartbeat was a prayer, every breath an offering, not to prove anything, but because I had seen what it meant to be alive, truly alive, and I didn't want to waste it. I didn't always succeed. I still got impatient, still wrestled with my ego, still doubted my worth. But now I caught myself sooner. I forgave myself quicker, because I had stood in the presence of perfect love, and it had shown me who I truly was. I wasn't broken, I wasn't behind, I was becoming. And in that becoming, I carried the light not as a torch to preach with, but as a quiet flame that warmed the ordinary. Because the sacred is not somewhere else, it's here. Now in this always. I didn't expect the next lesson to come from death again this time. Not my own, but my mother's. The woman who had once combed my hair with trembling hands after nightmares was now lying in a hospital bed, her body thin and translucent, her breath stretched across the moments like fading threads of silk. I sat beside her, holding her wrist gently, not to keep her here, but to anchor her in peace. And in that quiet, I felt something ancient stir within me. Not fear, not sadness, but a stillness so deep it felt sacred, the kind of stillness that had surrounded me during my near-death experience, the kind that whispers without words. This too is holy. I didn't need to speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because presence was enough. The way I had been held in silence by the divine was how I held her now, without pressure, without expectation. Just a deep, unwavering beingness. At one point, her eyes fluttered open for a brief second, and in them I saw a recognition that transcended this life. It was the same gaze I had shared with souls on the other side. There was no fear, only acknowledgement. Two spirits bowing to one another across lifetimes. When she passed, I didn't break. I didn't scream at the sky or collapse into despair. I walked out of the room, closed my eyes, and whispered, "Welcome home." Because I knew she wasn't gone. She had simply stepped into the place I had once been. She was not ending, she was continuing. Her form had faded, but her essence remained. My tears weren't for absence, they were for beauty, for the privilege of having loved her enough that her leaving left the world quieter, softer, and filled with echoes. In the weeks that followed, people looked at me strangely. "You're so calm," they'd say. "How are you not falling apart?" But I wasn't calm. I was cracked open, I had been shattered by life, death, and life again. And through every crack, the light continued to pour in. I still cried. I laughed too. I told stories of my mother without apology, even when my voice shook. Because grief was no longer something I tried to survive, it had become something I chose to honor. My journal became my sanctuary. I wrote her name in ink that didn't tremble. I wrote of the scent of her perfume on scarves I couldn't throw away. I wrote of the way her laughter sounded like bells on Christmas morning, and then almost without realizing I wrote something I'd never said aloud. Thank you for being one of my first mirrors, because now I understood we had chosen each other before breath, before birth. We were not mother and daughter by accident. We were souls who agreed to walk one another home. It was through this revelation that I began to speak about my near-death experience. Not on grand stages or in sanctuaries with stained glass. In living rooms, in hospice circles, in hospital break rooms with nurses who carried more grief than anyone noticed. I didn't use slideshows. I didn't quote theology. I just spoke. From the heart, I told the truth, not as I had been taught it, but as I had lived it. And every time I finished, there was always someone who cried, not out of sorrow, but out of recognition, because what they needed wasn't logic, it was permission. Permission to believe in what they already knew. I learned that truth doesn't always need to be declared. Sometimes it simply needs to be embodied. That's how the divine works. I think not through arguments, but through lives quietly lived in alignment. So I tried to live gently, to walk slowly, to breathe with intention, to sit with those in pain and say less, to listen more. Not because I had answers, but because I knew the power of present. I had been on the receiving end of sacred presence once, and it had changed everything. One evening, as the sky bled into amber and the crickets began their songs, my daughter asked Mom, "Will you die again someday?" I smiled and ran my fingers through her hair. "Yes," I said, "but not really. I'll just walk into another room." She didn't fully understand. She didn't need to. Some truths aren't for the mind. They are for the soul to feel in time, so I began to live my remembrance. I lived it in the way I forgave faster, hugged longer, paused more often before responding. I lived it in the way I chose truth over being clever, kindness over being right. I lived it at red lights. When I noticed the trees dancing in a breeze others didn't see. I lived it in soup left on a neighbor's porch, in whispered names to stars, in catching myself before the old wounds dictated my voice. My near-death experience hadn't given me all the answers. It had given me something better, a relationship with the unknown, a willingness to be guided by mystery, a trust in something larger than logic, the kind of knowing that doesn't need proof because it feels like home. I came to trust 3 things with all my being: that love is the thread that runs through every soul, that our pain is not a punishment, but an invitation to wake up, and that we are more than these bodies always were, always will be. When I forgot, I looked to the stone on my nightstand, the one from the riverbank. I'd hold it and whisper, "I'm still here. I'm still learning. I haven't forgotten." One morning, I woke with a phrase in my chest. It wasn't mine. I hadn't read it or dreamed it. It had been given. Like all sacred things, it arrived gently but stayed loudly. It said, "This life is not about proving yourself worthy. It's about remembering you already are." I wrote it down, taped it to my mirror. I said it out loud on days when the old voices came creeping back, and slowly those voices lost their grip, because now I had memory not of events but of truth, and that truth reshaped the way I moved through the world. My breath became a blessing, and my presence became my offering. My life, flawed, tender, fully human, became my message. I was no longer just someone who had died and returned. I was someone who had remembered. There was a time when I believed I was broken, too shattered by childhood grief, too scarred by unanswered prayers, too hardened by years of trying to become someone worthy in God's eyes. I thought there were parts of me beyond repair. I used to hide from those wounds, pretend they weren't there, busy myself with perfection and performance. But my near-death experience changed everything. It took me beyond life, beyond pain, beyond the illusion of failure, and returned me with one truth echoing in my chest like a second heartbeat. Nothing is wasted, not the ache, not the silence, not the messy middle. I wanted to erase every part of my journey had been sacred soil, and from that soil had bloomed something stronger, deeper and more tender than I ever imagined. Wisdom born from heartbreak. Beauty grown from the compost of everything I thought disqualified me from love. It wasn't just the big losses that shaped me. It was the moments I used to overlook, the times I didn't speak when someone needed my voice, the glance I averted, the apology I never gave, the ways I abandoned myself while trying to be enough for someone else I had seen during my near-death experience, how even the smallest acts, especially the ones done or undone in secret, ripple outward. I watched as a single harsh word became a seed of insecurity in someone's life. And I saw how one moment of grace, a pause, a smile, a kind gesture could restore something invisible and vital. So now I move through life differently. I carry a quiet reverence for the unseen impact of my choices. I know I can't always control the outcome, but I can choose the energy I bring. Whether it's a conversation with a stranger, a moment alone in traffic, or a hug that lasts just a second longer, I let it matter, because it does. One afternoon, I was in my garden pulling weeds that had returned after a week of neglect. My hand curled around one particularly stubborn root, and as I tugged, I suddenly felt tears rise not from pain but from something deeper. That motion, that care, the simple attention. It broke open a memory of everything I hadn't done. All the moments I wished I'd loved better, spoken softer, listened longer. The regrets came flooding in, and just as I began to drown in them, I felt it again, that stillness, that voice I now knew wasn't outside me but within. Even your regrets can become prayers. I sank to my knees in the dirt and let the tears fall. And when they passed, I whispered, thank you to the sky, to the soil, to my younger self who had done the best she could with what she knew. I didn't need to be forgiven. I needed to remember that my story in all its imperfection was still holy. Since then, I've started telling people they're good. Just that, not perfect, not flawless, good. And it surprises them. It's like I've spoken a language their soul understands but their mind has never heard. Some laugh nervously, others deflect. But eventually I see it sink in, because I mean it. I see them beneath the armor, beneath the shame, beneath the stories they were told about who they had to be. I see what the light showed me, that every soul carries beauty, too sacred to measure. A few weeks ago, I was invited to share my near-death experience at a community gathering. I hadn't planned to go deep. I brought notes, told myself I'd stay surface level. But when I stood under the soft glow of those stage lights holding a folded paper, I never looked at. The words came like a river breaking through a dam. I told them the truth, not as a dramatic event, but as a mirror. This isn't just about what happened to me. I said, it's what's happening to all of us. We're waking up. Bit by bit, pain by pain, miracle by miracle. Afterward, a man approached me, his eyes full of something unspoken. He leaned in close and whispered, I was going to take my life tonight. I don't think I will now. I didn't try to comfort him. I didn't recite a verse or tell him everything would be okay. I simply took his hand and said the only thing I knew he needed to hear. Nothing is wasted. His pain, his struggle, even his despair. It didn't disqualify him from love. It connected him to it because I had seen it, I had lived it, and now I could hold it with him. That night, I lay in bed and placed my hand over my heart. You too, I whispered, you're still learning, still becoming. And nothing in you is wasted either. Lately, I've been dreaming again, not just ordinary dreams, but vivid, electric, cinematic visions. Sometimes I see my guide from the other side standing on a cliff that stretches beyond time. He doesn't speak. He just looks at me and nods like he knows I'm still doing the work. Sometimes I hear music tones so pure they feel like they belong to a language I used before I was born. And sometimes I just float weightless, surrounded by something that feels like breath turned into light. The best part, I don't fear death anymore, but more importantly, I don't fear life. I'm not afraid to mess up, to say the wrong thing, to cry in public, or laugh too loud. I don't need to be understood by everyone. I don't need to be perfect. I just need to be present. The near-death experience taught me that love isn't fragile. It doesn't shatter when we stumble. It holds us steady, even when we fall. One evening, as I walked the trail behind my home, I spotted a small bird hopping near the underbrush. Its wing was broken, fluttering uselessly. I knelt beside it, unsure if I should help or simply bear witness. And as I watched it struggle, my heart cracked open, not with sorrow, but with recognition. I had once believed my own brokenness made me unworthy of flight, but now I understood the wing doesn't heal in hiding. It heals in the light. So I whispered to the bird what I now whisper to every part of myself. You are not your wound. You are your will to keep moving anyway. Because I hadn't just returned from a near-death experience, I had returned from forgetting. And in the remembering, I became what I was always meant to be, a living invitation to feel, to weep, to wonder, to rise, to be fully human, and to know without a shadow of a doubt that nothing is ever wasted. It didn't arrive with thunder or light. There was no burning bush, no angelic voice, no moment that screamed divinity. The final truth came to me in silence while I stood in front of my mirror, brushing my hair like I had done 1,000 times before. My fingers moved through strands gone softer with age. The reflection staring back at me no longer looked like a woman trying to prove herself, or someone carrying years of guilt, or even a survivor of a near-death experience. What I saw in that mirror was something I hadn't recognized in decades. I saw a soul, not an idea, not a theory, not a metaphor, a real, living, breathing soul. And in that moment, the last piece of the puzzle settled gently into my heart. I had never been lost. I had only been asleep. All those years I spent searching, striving, measuring my worth against impossible standards. It was all rooted in forgetting that my existence was never a mistake, forgetting that my breath was already a prayer, forgetting that I came into this world already whole, and the God I had spent so many years trying to impress had never once asked for my perfection, only my presence, my full, vulnerable, flawed presence. I was given a second chance not to build some legacy or achieve greatness, but to live with extraordinary love inside the most ordinary moments, to walk slowly, to speak gently, to forgive quickly, to laugh from the belly and cry without shame. I no longer saw heaven as a prize waiting at the end. I saw it in the steam rising from a morning cup of tea, in the sound of my daughter humming while doing her homework, in the stillness between two heartbeats. The final lesson of my near-death experience didn't come from angels or sacred texts. It came in the quiet rhythm of being alive, in realizing that every time I showed up with kindness, even when I didn't feel like it, I was living that truth. Every time I stayed open, when it would have been easier to close, I was remembering. Every time I paused long enough to feel the wind on my face, I was reclaiming my place in the web of existence. Not above it, not beneath it, but within it. I stopped asking people what they believed. I started asking them what they remembered. Because belief can be shaped by fear, tradition, culture. But remembrance that's older, it's woven into the soul. It speaks in sensations, in tears that come without reason, in moments that feel familiar. Though you've never lived them before, I learned to trust that, to let go of needing to know and instead surrender to the knowing that rises from within. I began writing more in those final weeks, not for publication, not for applause, just for truth. My journal became a sanctuary for everything I had seen, felt, remembered. And on the last page, I wrote a message for whoever might one day find it, or maybe just for myself. Don't wait to die to wake up. Don't wait for a diagnosis to slow down. Don't wait for loss to open your heart. Every breath is a doorway. Every moment is a teacher, and every person you meet is a mirror. There is no test, no finish line, no spiritual checklist, only this: love more than you fear. Listen more than you speak, trust more than you understand. And if you can't do that today, then simply remember one day you will. That was my offering to the world. Not a doctrine, not a map, just a mirror. My story was never meant to be a rule book. It was meant to be a reflection. A near-death experience cracked me open. Yes, but it was love that made me whole. And that same love, the love that held me in the light, the love that pulled me back into this life through my daughter's whispered prayer. It's already inside you, not waiting to be earned, just waiting to be seen. We keep thinking we have to transcend humanity to touch the divine. But what I learned is that the most spiritual thing you can do is be fully human, feel deeply, fall, and get back up. Speak honestly, hold someone's hand when they're scared. Stay soft when the world demands you harden. It's not about escaping your body to find enlightenment, it's about entering it completely. With tenderness, with awareness, with the courage to live your truth even when no one else understands it. I now saw people through different eyes, not their achievements or their beliefs. I saw their energy, their unspoken longing to be seen, to be loved, to be reminded that they were not alone. I no longer measured anyone by their answers, only by the sincerity of their questions. And in that shift, I found connection where before there had only been distance. There were still days I forgot. Days when fear crept back in, when old patterns whispered lies about not being enough. But now I had something stronger than fear. I had memory, not just of the light, but of the feeling it gave me. The way it saw me, the way it knew me, the way it whispered. You are already everything you seek. And so I lived, I breathed. I chose softness again and again. I stopped apologizing for who I was and started honoring the path that had brought me here. Every scar a symbol, every mistake a stepping stone, every moment a chance to love just a little more. This is what I return to say. You don't have to die to come alive. You don't have to suffer to be worthy. You don't have to earn what was already yours before your first breath. The greatest miracle is not what happens when you leave your body. It's what happens when you fully enter it. When you allow yourself to be here, fully, messily, beautifully human, let your life be your prayer, let your breath be your offering, let your presence be your message. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to remember who you are and to remind others of the same. If something in this story has stirred something inside you, if even a small voice in you whispered, "I remember," then please don't let it fade. Carry it, share it, live it. Someone out there is waiting for exactly what you now hold, and now stepping out of this story and back into my voice as the one who shared it. I want to say this directly to you. If Evelyn's journey spoke to your heart, then you are part of this ripple too. You felt the remembrance, the weight of what matters, the light of what's possible. So if this video resonated with you, I invite you right now to take action. Share it with someone you love. Leave a comment below and tell your truth. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Not because I want numbers, but because I believe we're building something together here. A space for remembrance, for presence, for soul. This isn't just my story, it's yours too. And the world is ready for what you carry.